Good afternoon. Welcome to the first Intergovernmental Committee meeting of 2022, Charlotte City Council. My name is co-chair Braxton Winston. We're going to go ahead and try to get right into this very important meeting, and we'll probably get into the weeds of some details about a lot of federal money that'll be flowing this way shortly. So why don't we start with introductions? We're all virtual, I do believe. So we'll go through committee members, city staff, and then our guests, and we'll turn it over to Mr. Fenton, who will guide us through the agenda. Again, I'm Braxton Winston, co-chair.
Co-chair Tariq Bakari.
Good afternoon, everyone. Matt Newton, committee member.
Member Ed Driggs.
That's Ed Driggs, everyone.
Ed Driggs, committee member.
Go ahead, staff.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Dana Fenton. I'm with the city manager's office.
Brent Cagle, assistant city manager.
Haley Gentry, aviation director.
Michael, airport CFO.
Jack Christine, chief operating officer for the airport.
Ted Kaplan, chief business officer for the airport.
And to our guests.
Chris McDowell, contract lobbyist for North Carolina, KTS Strategies.
Nelson Freeman, contract lobbyist on behalf of the city, KTS Strategies.
John Easterling, contract lobbyist on behalf of the city of Charlotte, KTS Strategies.
Amanda Honecker with KTS Strategies on behalf of the city.
All right, I think that's everybody. If we'll give it a beat if anybody else hasn't introduced themselves. Mr. Fenton, I think you can take it away.
Hi, Catherine Coomer.
Okay.
Hey, Catherine Coomer, Sustainability, Resiliency, and Governmental Affairs Officer for the Charlotte Area Transit System.
Thank you, Mr. Winston. Again, this is Dana Fenton with the city manager's office. And Mr. Winston is exactly right. We have a pretty full agenda today. We're going to start off with a federal legislative update, followed by our airport people talking about the fourth parallel runway and the associated airfield improvement projects. And we'll probably be talking about the bipartisan infrastructure plan when we talk about the airport projects as well. Then we'll get to a state legislative update, followed by the 2022 committee work plan. And I understand at this point that we do have a technical issue with our presenter from Holland and Knight getting on. So I would ask the staff to bring up the fourth parallel runway presentation first, and then we could come back to the federal legislative update later on in the meeting. And as it's being brought up, excellent. Thank you very much. Let me introduce this topic to you. And this is something that the city council has been very, very involved in over the last several years, especially. The fourth parallel runway in the associated airfield improvement projects. This is something that we have been talking about for several years. We know that the airports has been doing a lot of work on this, including an environmental assessment. And on top of that, this is something that you have had in your legislative agenda for talking about with our congressional delegation over the last several years. And it looks like at this time, there's a lot coming to fruition here with these projects. And I'll say projects in the plural, not the singular. There are some pretty substantial projects here. And then, of course, the recent enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law really has put a big boost into airport funding. And that is something that we could talk about as well here, too. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Haley Gentry, the airport's aviation director. Haley?
Thank you, Dana. Good afternoon, council members. Thank you for allowing us to present and share some of our story today.
I think that we have a great story to share with you, and I'm excited to further explain some of our needs. Next slide, please. I thought I would start by giving you a quick recap, and is doing that, I will just say that I'm joined today by our 3 deputy directors at the airport. Each of them has their area of specialty, and I brought them along not knowing all of the nature of the questions you may be interested in hearing, so you could hear from some of the folks who are most intimately involved with what we're going to talk about today. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining me, and let's jump right in. A quick recap of where we are in our COVID recovery. The numbers that you're seeing before you are last year's 2020 numbers. We wound up ending the year at about 27 million passengers. That is very different than our 2019 numbers and what I would call our norm. Our norm has been about 52 million in 2019. So this gives you some perspective of what COVID has done in our environment. I'll share with you shortly how we're pushing beyond that for this year and expecting different numbers. But a little background, American Airlines, as you know, operates their second largest hub here, and they were really the driving force at what I would consider a much faster recovery than many communities were experiencing. I'd also like to call out to you on this page the $24.6 billion annual economic impact. Charlotte Douglas International Airport alone is 4% of the state's gross domestic product. I think that speaks volumes for the importance of this to our North and South Carolina economies, and it really presents the background for why what we're going to talk about is so important. Next slide, please. So where are we in terms of a recovery? What you'll see on here is a comparison of 2019, 2020, and 2021 data. And if you look at the difference in January 2019 to 2021, you'll see a 44% drop. These are departing passengers. And then as you move ahead, we start to catch up. You look over in July, and we're about even with our typical summer numbers. And in terms of ending the calendar year, we're estimating that we're going to end 2021 at about 43 million passengers. That is an unaudited number. So we are projecting that. We do not have all of the official data reported at this point. However, I think what you can see is the trends, with the exception of when we have particular COVID outbreaks, are starting to trend much more similar to our normal numbers. 27 million passengers is nothing to sneeze at. We were thrilled to death to have that, but we are trending toward more of a normal environment for Charlotte. Next slide, please. This gives you a comparison of Charlotte compared to the rest of the country. These are DOT numbers, and if you look at the blue line, that is Charlotte, and it is showing in September of 21 compared to September of 2018 that we were at 109% of those numbers. So things are, again, moving in the right direction. You can see the rest of the country not faring as well. I will attribute that to the strength of the hub and the fact that American Airlines announced very early on in the pandemic that they would be doubling down on their 2 hubs in Dallas and Charlotte. Okay, so getting to the meat of what we're here to share with you today. In 2016, we completed a master plan update focused on our airfield and terminal facilities. As a result of that, the data that was analyzed in that process in terms of our forward projections, where we would be, what our requirements would be to operate this airport 10, 20, 30 years out, were used to identify the need for a future runway. As a result of that, we kicked off an environmental assessment in 2019. This is a very tedious process. It looks at all elements of environmental impacts. It is a federal government, excuse me? I'm sorry, I thought we had a question. It is part of a federal governance process. So we have been working through this for some time now, and we are expecting a record of decision in late February, early March. Next slide, please. So here's a look at what it's been environmental assessment has been considering. You will see on this chart, there's a fourth parallel runway in the purple. And then there are 4 adjacent projects. Well, it's really 2 adjacent projects in 2 different phases for a total of 4 more projects on the airfield. Collectively, this is the next future steps of our airfield. The north end around taxiway and the south end around taxiway have been identified as high-value safety projects. We have been able to pull them out and do their own advanced environmental assessment that has been occurring. And some of you may remember you have already taken council action on construction associated with the north end around taxiway several times. So that project is underway, as well as the south end around taxiway. In layman's terms, these projects are going to prevent you from having to sit when you are waiting to come to the terminal building. If you have landed on the outermost westerly runway, you have to wait quite a bit. This will allow you to go around the end of the runway, keep the activity flowing, keep the aircraft coming and going, and it is reducing the need to cross active runways, which is a considerable safety enhancement. The fourth parallel runway that you see on here is a 10,000 foot runway, and we are looking at a 2024 construction date for that, with a 2027 or 2028 completion date. You may also recall that you've already approved a preliminary engineering contract associated with this, and that will occur as soon as we complete the record of decision, or receive the record of decision, rather. Okay, next slide, please. So these projects, as you're looking at them, these 4 independent projects represent $1 billion in airfield projects. And that is not money to take lightly. We anticipate seeking $440 million in federal funding. $300 million of that will be in the form of an LOI, which is an agreement where we will reimburse ourselves over 5 or 6 years for that project. It's a commitment from the feds for that amount of money. And then, of course, 140. So that leaves us with $600 million in remaining cost. We feel like the $300 million is extremely legitimate. For those of you who are familiar with this process, it is a competitive process. We will be competing with other national airports that have projects that are also requiring federal funding. It's based on eligibility, priority, safety, security, delay avoidance. There are a lot of factors that are considered, but we do feel like $300 million is a legitimate number, and that Charlotte will score very well for that. That's based on our previous experience with this. There is some element of subjectivity. However, we think based on our growth, based on our return from COVID, as I said, Charlotte will qualify very well. It does leave $600 million in remaining cost, which will have to be picked up by the airlines either through rates and charges and or other financial resources that the airport may have. I want to let you know we've already chatted with our federal delegate staff to make them aware that this is coming. This is the sort of thing that's a heavy lift, and we will have to tap into all of our resources to be sure we get all eyes on this funding request. And we anticipate the need for this conversation starting as soon as we complete or receive, rather, the ROD from the EA. So having said that, that is all I have to share with you about what our needs are. I'd be happy to entertain any questions or talk further about any of the specific projects or anything else you're interested to discuss.
Mr. Fenn, looks like you wanted to hop in real quick.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I really appreciate Haley and her crew preparing this presentation. This is something that I've wanted to do for quite a while now, especially since we had those meetings with the congressional delegation staff back in June or July of 2021. We had a really, really good reaction from them. The airport is supported by there's a strong base of support out there legislatively for airports, and especially Charlotte Douglas International Airport. So that helps in a lot of different ways. And we heard nothing but excitement about these projects that are coming forth. So, but thank you, Mr. Winston. I appreciate that.
My questions were going to be, and again, don't necessarily have to be answered right here, right now, but with this kind of quick turnaround with information that we're going to be hopefully receiving in the next, seems like the next month, a couple of months, how does that impact the conversations that we have with our federal delegation coming up this spring? Also, just thinking about kind of the meta issues that we're dealing with from a Charlotte City Council perspective, what kind of communication or engagement we can have with other, I know we mentioned federal delegations, but other local delegations of local governments to understand the importance of this and the possibility or importance of getting kind of regional support behind this.
Dana, do you want to comment to some of that, or would you like me to?
Yeah, I'd be glad to start off, and Haley, please follow up when I'm done. Your first question, Mr. Winston, was about how the environmental assessment would impact our discussions with our congressional delegation in the spring. As you said, we'll be meeting with them at, whether hopefully in person, but if not, then virtually. I think that the record of decision that would come out would really help energize this, help boost, help catapult their participation in trying to get the funding for Charlotte Douglas. So I see that as a positive there, in my estimation, that is. And Haley, and Mr. Winston, I can't remember what your second question was, but I think it had to do with regional support for these projects. Yeah, let me share with you. Haley and I have spoken quite a bit about this. And also we've also talked a lot about this with our federal contract lobbyists from Holland and Knight, is that our delegation would probably be out looking to do a regional letter of support for these projects. That is to have a letter that would be drafted and everybody would sign on board. It wouldn't be just our own delegation here, but it would go outside to northwest of us, north to the west and east, and also down into South Carolina as well. And I think I know that Haley can speak better to this than I can, but I know that there have been a lot of members of Congress who have come to Charlotte Douglas for tours, or they might not have come for tours, but they may have tried to stop by and ask questions about the operations of the airport and what's being planned for the future. And I know of that, over the years, there's always seems to be a member of Congress who's not in our immediate Mecklenburg delegation who is stopping to talk with Haley, and before that, Brent Cagle, of course. So Haley, you want to take it from there?
Yes, Councilmember Winston. I will tell you that we received great support across both states for this airport, and for that we're very fortunate. I think now is the time to call on those members that we've been working with so closely for many years. Brent spent a great deal of time fostering those relationships, and we have continued to invest in those, and now is the time for us to really engage those people who have been cheering us along the way. I will tell you from a federal perspective, the record of decision is the green light for our project to advance to reality. So now is the time when we receive that for us to go to work and be sure we're doing everything we can to receive our maximum federal funding. I do anticipate that this is going to be the premier airfield project in North and South Carolina for many years. I do know that there are some other improvements scheduled for airports in different parts of the state, But if you keep in mind, and if any of you regularly fly through, you will know a lot of those flights stop here in Charlotte on their second leg and pick up additional folks. So they benefit from this as well. And I think that getting bipartisan and support from both states is really going to be not a difficult and challenging thing to do.
Mr. Bukhari or any of the committee members have any questions or comments?
No, I just think that it'll be very important for us to, everyone's done a good job at building the coalitions and the group of advocates and come up with the plan. I think we need to really tighten up. All right, who are the champions going to ultimately be, and how are we going to arm them as necessary for the outcomes we're looking for? And I think, figuring out both those champions and the strategy there, as well as, helping them with that work of the coalition of other representatives that are going to be in support of them. I think we can take that step and it'll put the icing on the cake of how we've gotten here into this good, strong position. But by no means is it a guarantee. So we need to kind of take that mission into our own hands.
Mr. Chair, it's Ed Driggs. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, how does the process work in terms of applying for federal funds versus moving ahead with investment in some of the engineering and preliminary work? Do we have to start down this road and then wait to find out whether the federal money comes through?
I can speak to that, and depending how in depth we go in this, I may ask Mike Hill, our CFO, to comment. But we already have a preliminary engineering contract, and I believe that will take us to about 30% of the project. So we intend to start that as soon as we get the record of decision. There is a process for going through the LOI, and we have already been talking with the FAA about that process and the timetable for that. So as soon as we get our record of decision, we will nail down the schedule where we will know a response timeline from the FAA. Mike, is there anything else you'd like to comment about that process?
Yeah, Haley, the only other thing that I'd like to add is just to recognize that the airport has been the beneficiary of a number of federal grant programs over the last 18 or so months since the beginning of the pandemic. Those programs have allowed us some financial flexibility to be able to pursue some things like undertaking the environmental assessments that are currently underway. In terms of planning, we'll be looking to potentially program some of the money that we hope to receive under the bipartisan infrastructure program that was recently signed into law by the president just a couple months ago. And so those resources will enable us to get us underway. And then, as Haley mentioned too, there's also an airline LOI process that has to be undertaken as well, that we have to engage and get the support of the airlines, and some of these expenses associated with some of the airfield improvements may be included in their rate base. So we believe that we have the financial resources right now to be able to start the project, and working with the FAA to secure this $300 million commitment in the form of the LOI will be absolutely critical to allow us to bring it home.
Right. So we are very confident that we're going to be able to make these improvements. And if there's any uncertainty about this particular application, there is the potential for kind of a plan B, if you will. Would that be the right way to put it?
Yes, sir.
Good. Obviously, we're grateful to the federal government for the tower and appreciate our relationship with them. I just like to think that we have a little bit of flexibility depending on what actually happens. But thank you for that.
Mr. Newton, do you have anything?
No, sir.
All right, with that, Mr. Fenton, I think we can move on. Thank you very much, Ms. Gentry, and everybody for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Winston, and thank you, Haley and her crew. They're great to work with, and really look forward to working with them in the future. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we're going to go back to our federal legislative update. Technical issues that Rich and Shauna have are now solved. And oh, there is the slide. So what we wanted to do for you in this presentation today was to start to do sort of a kickoff of what the Congress intends to focus on in 2022. Of course, it's an election year, and there's a lot of other things going on as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to either Rich or Shauna. Please go right ahead.
I think it's me starting out. So thanks everybody for having us today. We appreciate the opportunity to sit with you a bit and go through what's been going on up here in Washington, which has been quite a lot, what we expect to be happening over the next year on top of that, and everything that we expect to be in process for the city in the 2022 congressional and legislative agenda. So next slide, please. So obviously it's been a really, really busy 2021 with most of the activity focused on the infrastructure bill that was just referenced by the airport folks, as well as the American Rescue Plan coming out of COVID last winter and this fall on Build Back Better. 2022 is really going to be a cleanup year from a legislative perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, with a lot of emphasis shifting to executive branch action by the administration on core initiatives ranging from climate change to drug pricing to infrastructure implementation. Next slide, please. So just to kind of go through here, obviously the first thing out of the gate in the Biden administration was the American Rescue Plan, which was funding directed obviously to state and locals around the country to respond to COVID-19 and enable us to kind of get back on our feet. That was in anticipation of getting to July and having life go back to normal. Obviously, instead of that, we got the Delta variant. So I think a lot of those funds really helped you all in Charlotte and major cities around the country deal with the unexpected flow of the coronavirus moving into this fall, even with Omicron after Thanksgiving. The infrastructure bill became law this fall, and obviously much of that money will be pumping through the system this year. I will just note for the council that we are in a position where about half the accounts in the infrastructure bill will not be fully funded until the FY22 appropriations bills become law. And that won't happen until at least February 18th, as we have a continuing resolution in place while Republicans and Democrats in Congress continue to negotiate the final bills. So we're still waiting for the infrastructure bill to be fully funded, but obviously everything from water infrastructure to transportation, broadband, et cetera, will be coming down to the city. About half the money in the infrastructure bill comes via competitive grants, and so we'll talk more about that, and that will be something we spend a lot of time on. We also finished up our annual National Defense Authorization bill.
I just got one question, clarifying question. Is that appropriations bill that you mentioned in potentially coming in February, is that analogous or something different to the idea of the Build Back Better plan, which is a spending bill?
No, the appropriations bill is the annual 12 bills that Congress passes to fund the federal government on an annual basis. Normally finish those 12 bills up by Christmas, but this year, because we were so focused on Build Back Better in December, we sort of booted them down the road till February to finish them up.
Thank you.
Sure. And then the last thing I was just going to reference was the debt limit increase, which we obviously finished up in early December, which took some pressure off of continuing to fund the federal government. Next slide, please. So with regard to 2022, we have a couple of key dates that I want to surface for you here. First, on the bottom of the slide, obviously we already mentioned federal funding for the federal government, which expires February 18th. Congress may need a slight extension to finish up the appropriations measures, but we expect by early March they should have all of that done, and all the money will be flowing through normal federal programs in addition to the new infrastructure accounts. March 1st will be the State of the Union this year. September 30th is the end of fiscal year 2023. Will be the end of fiscal year 2022, October 1st, the beginning of fiscal year 2023 for the federal government. And then obviously the midterm elections coming up on November 8th, with all 435 House members up for re-election and 34 Senate seats up. And as we get closer, obviously we'll talk a little bit more about how the elections look. So we're really digging in on some of those cleanup items, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. Federal appropriations, as I already talked about, and then Build Back Better. The status of Build Back Better as we kind of sit here today is that negotiations haven't restarted yet between Senator Manchin and the White House to figure out a compromise on the legislation. Senator Manchin, as you all know from reading the paper, basically shot the bill down right before Christmas. We are expecting the bill to get slimmed down probably to somewhere between 800 or 900 billion and $1.5 trillion at the end of the day, likely with climate provisions, drug pricing provisions, the revenue title in terms of changing the tax mix from the current corporate taxes, as well as free kindergarten and a couple other social programs to be kicked in. But it won't be the full Build Back Better that the House passed, back in the early fall. Obviously, this week we're working on voting rights legislation and changes to the Senate rules. We are not expecting right now that there's going to be some kind of breakthrough that would send voting rights legislation to the president, but always happy to be surprised. But those negotiations will continue even after this week if that doesn't happen. We have legislation pending in conference between the House and the Senate called USICA that will change our competitive relationship with China. And that legislation probably will get completed in the second quarter. And then obviously the president's spending a lot of time filling out his sub-cabinet and getting judicial nominations through. So with that, let me hand off to Shauna to take it from here on the next slide.
So good afternoon, everyone. So good to see you and Happy New Year. Thanks, Rich. So Rich mentioned the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is what we like to call it up here in Washington. It was signed into law, and there now the federal government and the federal agencies are starting to have implementation of that. And so what you probably saw with an announcement of Mayor Mitch Landrieu, he is kind of the transportation czar in the White House. So he is kind of taking the bull by the horns and really making sure that things are being implemented and executed in a timely way. You know, if Build Back Better doesn't get done, then this will be the primary piece of legislation that folks are going to have to hang their hats on this year and moving into the election season. So it's so important that things are done in a timely manner. I have to say the White House has done a pretty good job with communicating, what they're doing as it relates to the implementation. That last Friday, they issued a fact sheet outlining the progress that they've made to date on the implementation of the legislation. And we've shared that with Dana, happy to circle that back around. But as you all may have heard, the roads, bridges, and transportation infrastructure, they announced the bridge program within the last few weeks. They also just recently announced that they're going to have another RAISE grant process coming up soon. The NOFA should be updated by the end of January. The expiration date or the deadline date for that will be in April. And congratulations on your RAISE grant that we just recently got at the end of the year. And so we're encouraging folks to apply for that again for the next round because there's plenty of funding there. The Vice President announced the EV charging action plan. which is a high priority for the administration. And then also, the highway funding, they put out an announcement of $52.5 billion for highway funding. And so there's just a number of things that they've done related to water, high-speed internet, clean energy and environmental remediation. They just recently announced $1 billion in funding to clean up 49 Superfund sites. And so they're doing a really good job in trying to make sure that the bill is moving forward, and the local governments and entities that are supposed to receive the funding from the legislation, that's happening in a timely manner. So anything that we're interested in, we'll be sure to be working with the team to make sure any funding that's coming down the pike, or any NOFAs, any issues that we may be having in understanding what's going on, we're happy to reach out to the Department of Transportation so that we're ensuring that these dollars are coming to the city of Charlotte. Next slide, please. And so once again, this is just the breakdown. I believe we shared this with you all the last time we spoke, but this is just the breakdown of the different level of funding for each category over the 5-year period. We had mentioned previously there's 40 new programs that are coming out of this legislation that they have to build up. And so that's why it's so important that the White House and the Department of Transportation works closely together, and they have a full plethora of folks on the team to ensure that the new programs are built up, as well as the other accounts are plussed up and moving forward. Next slide, please. So Rich mentioned kind of where we are with Build Back Better. We're hopeful that they'll be able to negotiate something. It'll be a smaller version of what we saw earlier that passed the House. But, the majority leader is saying that he's going to be moving something forward. So we're watching that closely. One of the things that I did want to note, we worked really hard at Holland and I to make sure that there was $5 billion in funding for crime prevention, and that would go directly into communities and violence prevention programs. We're working hard to make sure that stays in the bill. We haven't heard anything different. So we're hopeful that will remain, but that was a priority for a lot of local governments, and we've been working very hard to make sure that money stays in whatever it is that comes out of the negotiation. Next slide. And this is just kind of the implementation. Where we are now is making sure that, from the November to May side of the chart, that the timelines are being met, the awards are coming out in a timely manner, and that, local governments, particularly the folks that we work with, have a clear understanding of what those timelines are, and that we're getting in front of the appropriate people so we can get some of the funding in the competitive and discretionary grant process. So most of those programs have to be stood up and, kind of executed by June of 2022. Next slide. As it relates to immigration reform, this has been a part of our federal agenda. Congressional Democrats are regrouping. It was a part of the Build Back Better plan. It doesn't look like it's going to make it in whatever the next version of that is, BBB 2.0. So, we'll be, watching out closely to see kind of what the Democratic leadership decides to do as it relates to immigration reform. Next slide, please. And then these are the next steps. We'll have another federal legislative update in February, and then we'll start to plan for our congressional delegation briefings in March, and making sure that we're covering all the, important topics as it relates to our agenda, as well as if there's other meetings within the Biden administration that we would like to pursue. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rich and Shawna, for that. And Mr. Winston, if there's any questions that members have, I think this would be appropriate time.
Thank you for the update. I think for me and how all this lines up, of course, transportation infrastructure is probably going to be one of the largest investments that we're going to ask of our constituents over this next decade. It's just a recurring question of how do our internal processes line up with what's going on in Washington to take as much advantage of potential opportunities there. I think we're all in step with that. But if there's anything that we need to be concerned about that we haven't touched in the past, I think be grateful to know that now. But with that, Mr. Bukhari, any other?
Yeah, I just have a comment and a question. The comment is, I think, when you look at that table of all the topic headers and the dollar amounts up for grabs, I think it would behoove us to take a more proactive role around here in that. It seems like, yeah, there it is right there. It seems like, if you kind of look historically at how we've done things over the last several years with federal kind of funding and the lobbying for that, it's really kind of just been light rail and that broader kind of thing. And very few people are involved in the actual nuts and bolts of figuring all that out. I think every one of those should be some kind of thing where there's members of the community, there's members of this council, and there's members of staff where we're looking at our current problem statement and the rules of operating within those areas. Where is our specific council-defined strategy for going after roads and bridges money when we know that's a huge part of what we need to do? And not just kind of it sprinkled into a broader TMN need, right? But we can go outside of the envelope there and figure out ways to go and get these federal dollars, again, that in many ways we've sent up there to come back and go to work. And I think the art will be figuring out, okay, well, are there matches required versus are there some topics where we can go after it and make certain cases? And I don't think we have the right transparent view into that process, let alone the direct involvement. So that would be my comment of a takeaway from here, that we be a little more directly involved in our future from that side. And my question is in regards to, and if you don't know the answer, that's no problem. We can circle up later. But from our federal folks, does anyone know the current status and forecast for the Safe Banking Act? Particularly, Congress has shown some hindrances around letting that move forward. A lot of people are bullish with it moving through the House and the new mechanisms they're putting behind it. And it's relevant for us for two reasons. One, North Carolina and the General Assembly is obviously looking very hard at our own medicinal cannabis approach in the coming year and what that will look like. And two, Charlotte is, among other things, a banking headquarters and hub. So for those two reasons, obviously that legislation is of import to us. I'm just curious, does it feel like some of the rumors and indications we're seeing that could indeed make it through the Senate, given its new armed forces mechanism that it's going through, or is it pretty much a long shot still?
It's still iffy this year, in part because there are conflicts in the broader Democratic conference as to whether to move forward just on something like safe banking without dealing with decriminalization, some of the other cannabis policy issues that invariably end up getting discussed at the same hearings with it. And there's still some resistance in the Senate among Republicans. Senator Crapo and other important senators. Senator Crapo is the ranking Republican on the Banking Committee, who have been, resistant to the legislation in anything like its current form. So I wouldn't say it's definitely not going to happen, but I wouldn't say it's highly likely to happen, if that helps.
Got it. Yeah, if you could keep us up to speed ongoing, because if it's likely not to happen, I think we just kind of passively keep our eye on it. But if there's a scenario by which it could be happening, one, given what's going to happen statewide potentially this year, paired with two, we have a huge concentration of the very banks that would need to be involved in that. I think Charlotte is indeed a stakeholder that should keep our finger on the pulse of that. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Driggs?
Mr. Chair, I had one question. The Vice President, when she was here, talked about a portion of the infrastructure bill that would head to North Carolina. and I haven't been able to see the slides because I'm in the car, but are the numbers we just heard kind of consistent with that indication we got from her? Because I thought the number that she mentioned was low compared to a lot of the things that we hope to be able to do in North Carolina, particularly in Mecklenburg County.
Mr. Driggs, this is Dana Fenton. The numbers that are shown on the new spending breakdown are the overall top line summary figures that have been advertised for a national audience over the last several months. And the figures that the vice president gave out or might have cited, I'm not sure where those are from, actually. I have seen several different versions from congressional offices, and I would be glad to try to track down to see what we can find in terms of what she was saying that day.
Okay, I guess we can look into that a little further. I was just concerned that the number she mentioned, in my mind, implied a relatively small amount for Mecklenburg County, given that I think $7 billion out of the 9 was going to be for roads, and we have a lot of statewide needs in terms of roads. So I just wondered how much of it would actually make it to Mecklenburg County and Charlotte. But I guess we could just keep watching that. We don't need to dwell too much on whatever it was she announced at that meeting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Dana, there is a sheet that I can forward over to you on kind of the breakdown for North Carolina. It doesn't give it by county, but it provides a little bit more information regarding the funding that will come to the state.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Ms. Newton, you have anything? We're good?
I'm good. No, sir. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Fenn?
Thank you, Mr. Winston. I want to thank Rich and Shana for the presentation, and we look forward to working with them over the next several months, and especially the next 2 months when we'll be meeting with our congressional delegation in March. Okay, great. Let's go now to the next presentation, the state legislative update from our state contract lobbyist with KTS Strategies. And by the way, there was a name change for the lobbying arm of the Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton law firm. And so you'll hear the KTS Strategies label. And we still have the same contractual relationship, the same people. Nothing's really changed except for the name. And that's done quite a bit with law firms nowadays. They have a separate organizational entity or corporate entity for their lobbying arm as opposed to the law arm. So anyways, I'm going to turn it over now to Ches, Nelson, Amanda, and John for a state legislative update. Thanks a lot. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dana. It's good to be here and good to see you all. The biggest update we have for right now since our last update is there is no update. There has been very little happening at the state level aside from redistricting. That's been the main focus of everyone for the last couple of weeks. There's currently litigation that has been ruled on at the Court of Appeals that is now going to the North Carolina Supreme Court on what needs to happen with the maps. No one who predicts that they know what's going to happen with the maps is telling you the truth, because no one actually knows except the 7 justices. Right now, our Supreme Court is 4-3 Democrat majority. There is one justice who is very much considered a moderate and is somewhat of a swing vote in how the court may come down on this. Over the last couple of days, the General Assembly and the Senate will vote tomorrow, has been working a piece of legislation through the process that will push back the primary. They originally scheduled it for March. The Court of Appeals moved it until May 17th, and then the General Assembly just moved it to June. The reason for that is they're anticipating having to redraw some or all of the maps. The maps that are in dispute are the state House maps, the state Senate maps, and the U.S. House maps. And they're anticipating having to redraw some of those. Pushing the primary back gives them time to redraw those districts again based on whatever the court orders. I will note that the lower courts ruled that the maps were not okay. They went to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals, 3-judge panel with 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat affirmed that the maps were okay, and the losing side appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, so that's where it'll go next. But that's pretty much all that's happened in Raleigh since we last spoke.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Winston, I'll hand it back to you.
Mr. Chair, could I ask a question about that?
Absolutely.
So the speaker has indicated that in his mind, the drawing of these maps is the sole responsibility of the legislature. The courts had suggested that they might draw a map. I believe that was kind of one possibility that was alluded to. So I guess my first question is it certain that if these maps are found to be unacceptable, the process of changing them will go back to the legislature? And my second question, just to put it out there, has to do with the remaining issues of the timing of the election, particularly as it pertains to us here. So what we have heard is that the primary would move to June instead of May, as previously ordered, based on the legislation. But what does that mean in terms of when we should expect the local elections to take place? At one point, the legislature did pass a bill that specified what was going to happen with us, but of course that has been superseded by these court challenges.
So to answer your first question, it could go either way. It is pretty clear in the state constitution and the United States Constitution that the North Carolina General Assembly is responsible for drawing the North Carolina congressional districts and the state legislative maps. In previous iterations of this lawsuit, which has been ongoing in some form or fashion for the last 12 years, the court has ruled in certain occasions that the General Assembly cannot draw the maps. Those decisions have been ruled to the U.S. Supreme Court, or have been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they've either declined to hear it or not ruled on the matter. And so I get all the years mixed up, but a couple years ago, the Supreme Court hired what they called a special master, which is a title that I'd like to have in anything. But they hired a special master to redraw the district maps. And they drew a couple around Raleigh, a couple around Charlotte, a couple around Greensboro. And so the court could say these maps are completely invalid, start over. They could say these maps are completely invalid, we're going to do it. They could say these 10 districts in the Senate are not okay, these 20 in the House are not okay, and these 3 congressional seats are not okay, whatever. So they really have the opportunity, being a Supreme Court, to do whatever they want to do. And so we can anticipate if they rule that new districts must be drawn, with the primary being pushed back to June, that gives the General Assembly sufficient time to redraw those maps. But like I said, they could say they're going to redraw the maps, and that could be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court may not take it up. They may take it up this time and set some precedent that's going to impact the entire country. Who knows? But it's very much up in the air.
So they could. That was my point, that that decision by the Supreme Court, if they decided to draw the maps, might be appealable to the U.S. Supreme Court to resolve the question of whether the Supreme Court or the legislature has precedence in that situation. Is that right? That's right. And they've appealed it in the past. I'm kind of reading the tea leaves. I doubt the legislature would appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, because they've kind of been down that track before with a very similar court who did not want to hear the issue. And this is an issue that's really across the country. Redistricting is happening in all 50 states. And so it's a very complicated question, not just in North Carolina. We live in the fishbowl here, and it seems like it's always been talked about, but that is happening across the country. So it is a national issue. And maybe something happens with
President Biden's proposed election legislation, or maybe something happens in Congress that changes this. But for where it is now, it's very much up in the air.
So what would our status be then to the other question? Let's say we go with the primary in June. What is the implication in terms of when our local elections take place? I mean, do we align with primaries kind of as envisioned before, or does the court decide that? I think in the one court decision, the Supreme Court decision said that the lower court could decide such administrative matters as the timing of the elections or whatever. But how do you think the question of our election timetable will unfold?
I don't know that. Go ahead, Nelson.
Yeah, this is Nelson. I believe that if legislation is considered this week, that there will be some clarification about what's going to happen with regard to local elections aligning with the statewide primary. So it will not be different. Also, I think there'll be the financial consideration about running it alongside the statewide primaries, as opposed, the state primaries, as opposed to running a secondary election. That's going to be under consideration. I will say that passing through the legislature today definitely saw lots of chiefs of staffs having some closed door meetings and conferring with folks. So I would definitely guess that the League of Municipalities has probably been called at this point to provide some of their recommendations on what works across the board for every single jurisdiction.
Nelson and Chester, if you guys don't mind keeping us up to date on particularly any decision-making or conversations that happen around, I think we're all understanding and set that our primaries need to be the same for our delayed stuff from an odd year and what's going on this year. But the ability to keep our general at a standalone date, which was previously the second primary runoff date that's established for this even year election. While if it isn't the case, I think we have to have a discussion amongst council before we come up with a council-based position. But clearly there has been appetite before that, we don't blend in a year of kind of, Senate candidates and a general in November and have the opportunity to at least maintain a general where these odd year type elections are held on their own. So if you guys could at least keep us up to date on how those conversations are moving, I think that'll be a really important thing for us to figure out.
Yeah, so we don't have confirmation of it yet, but
I would agree with Mr. Bakari that we have not had a council-based discussion on that, and we should. So I don't think council has necessarily that position as of right now.
I just wanted to mention there are only 30-something municipalities that have districts. So this is not necessarily a League of Municipalities issue statewide. Yes, the local races, but we were the ones that were sort of different. We don't have a problem with our maps. So I don't know whether we are now lumped in with all the other municipalities in terms of the timing of our elections or how that works. But certainly want to make sure that they think about us.
We will. Yeah. One of the discussion points that was occurring this morning was about whether or not there would be any runoff elections with this further delayed primary. And so that's probably where the highest level of concern exists, is that date's going to go away from a statewide perspective, potentially.
We were already told we don't have a runoff, right? I assume that stands.
Yeah, I would assume that as well for us. I think the question now is, to what they just said, if they get rid of the normal even year big primary runoff, that then they've inadvertently gotten rid of our separate general timeline, and it's not even an option for us at that point.
Yeah. Anyway, Tark, we should probably keep in touch with those guys. All of us, but need to make sure they're aware of us.
Yes. Okay. What's next?
I got a couple of quick questions, guys. I didn't know if you're going to come back around to me, Braxton.
Yeah, sure.
Questions this time. So 2 quick questions. Thank you, Chester and Nelson, for the presentation. The first question, it's my understanding that the Court of Appeals reset the filing period for this year's elections to February the 24th to March the 4th. And I'm just wondering, if we're talking about the primary now being delayed, does that also mean that the filing period is going to be delayed as well? Do we have any sense or understanding of whether that would be the case? Delayed again?
It is most likely to be delayed. Right now, technically you can't have filing in the congressional races or the state legislative races because they don't know what the districts are going to end up in, and so it's kind of impossible to do. They did keep filing open for certain seats like Supreme Court and things like that aren't going to change, or statewide races, but because they just simply don't know what the districts are going to look like and where they're going to end up, they're going to have to push that back.
It was my understanding too, so this is my second question, and thank you for that answer. My second question, it's my understanding that the State Board of Elections had opined that the May primary would be the last date that the state would be able to engage in a primary election before this November. And I'm just wondering if that is still the case, if that has any bearing or impact, assuming that what I heard was correct, of course. Maybe I heard something mistakenly, but assuming it's correct, is that at all weighed in on any of this? I mean, do we foresee any of that posing a problem? It sounds like it won't, but has that been taken into consideration at all?
Yeah, that's been considered, and I can't remember exactly the amount of days that there has to be before an election for early voting, for getting the ballots prepared and things like that. I want to say the number's 74, but don't quote me on that. It has to be 74 days. And so pushing it back to June is within the window that they have to have, and that's where your filing period will start, right? Or filing period will have to close prior to that. So you have 74 days prior to the election date where the ballots are printed, early voting starts, all of that goes on. And then you have, in a primary, then when the general's after, you have to have another whole cycle there. You don't have a filing period, but you have to have that same 74. And I can't remember if it's 74, but I want to say it's 74. You have that same period because of the early voting and because of what goes on the ballots. Is a very detailed process. When you think about ballots, we have 11 million people in this state, and as many municipal districts and everything that you can think of. All of those ballots are different all the way down to a precinct level. And so that's a very complicated process that requires a certain amount of time, but it can go past the original May 17th date that they set, as we will see tomorrow when they move it to June 7th.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
All right, Ms. Fenn, I think we can move on. Thank you very much for the legislative update.
Yeah, thanks, Chaz and crew. Appreciate everything you guys are doing up there for us. And Mr. Chairman, the last item on our agenda today is the 2022 committee work plan. If that presentation can be brought up. And this is and next slide, please. This is something that came to us pretty quickly, and all the council committees are doing this. In that Mayor Lyles did send out a memorandum to all the members of the city council in an attempt to improve intra-council communications. She's requested each city council committee develop a work plan for this year that would identify the key policy questions to address and develop a work plan for those questions consistent with a 30, 60, 90-day plan. And the intent, she said, was after the committees approve that work plan, that the chairs of the various committees, in this case, co-chairs Bakari and Winston, would lead a discussion of the Intergovernmental Relation Committee's recommended work plan at the February 7th strategy session, which is in just a few more weeks. And just in case anyone wants to be reminded, the Intergovernmental Relations Committee, your charge is to review and recommend intergovernmental relations policies and relationship building activities in the state and federal legislative and executive branches. Next slide, please. And before I start to talk about this, because we're under a pretty tight deadline, this assignment came to us probably about a week ago or so now, and so we at the staff level we're trying to think of, gee, what are all the different policy questions that our committees have to bring up? And in this first one here. And please don't get put off by the number 1 up there. It's the first thing that came to my mind. Every year, you all have the duty of considering or proposing to the City Council federal and state legislative agendas for their consideration. That's something that this committee and previous committees have done on a regular basis throughout the year. So what we did there was just to take that question, put it in there, and put a work plan around it. And I think it's it looks like about a 60-day work plan, but it's really more like about 90 days. And then, of course, there's some extra time after that for the council to consider what the committee proposes. And so in those dates on there are generally the dates at which we have the committee get together to start looking at a long session or the odd year federal and state legislative agendas. It takes them more time to develop those agendas than it does in the even year session, of course. And then the second proposed key policy question that we're putting forth to you today is something that came from Mr. Picari and Mr. Winston, and that was to consider exploring municipal government consolidation here in Mecklenburg County. And this is an issue that has come up before several times in the county. And I can't remember when the last time this came up. I do recall one coming up about 10 years ago when former Mayor Fox was still in office. And of course, that didn't go anywhere. But since then, I cannot think of any initiatives or any suggestions that municipal government consolidation be considered here in Mecklenburg County. And I know that many of you are been longtime members of the community. You may have a better recall than I do of this question. But this is something, again, that Mr. Picari and Mr. Winston brought up as something that the committee might want to consider proposing to the City Council. And so with that committee, I'm going to hand it back to the co-chairs, Mr. Picari and Mr. Winston, if they would like to provide any additional information.
Mr. Picari, you want to start or you want?
Yeah, I'm glad to kick it off. I think that first one is less of a proposed key policy question, just more of, table stakes and our normal annual operating model. So if we look above and beyond that for what policy recommendations or proposals that we could bring forth with some real meat on it for this committee, I think Co-Chair Winston and I very much agreed at a high level in the direction of what can be done in relation to consolidation. And I think if we approach it both in the intergovernmental working kind of collaborative model that Councilman Winston has already undertaken and leads with county commissioners and school board members and things like that across the board. So it's coming from a staff supported but elected official collaboration. I think, starting from that as one part of the foundation and then moving to really a simple 3 kind of option spectrum where we ask staff and we really drill into the details of if we do nothing, right, and don't consolidate anything from where we are right now, this is where the lack of synergy creates additional cost, additional delays and times for things to be executed. And then on the other far side of that spectrum, there's a complete consolidation where we have a single body that handles everything that we consider today kind of the hardware and software of a city and county separated government together. And I think both of those on its own are going to be hard to do. It's going to be hard to stay status quo and continue with some of the issues that we have in a bifurcated model like this. It's going to be hard to get the political will to bring everything together. But we don't need to take that. Let's analyze it and see what that would take. But I think then more realistically, if we don't have that moonshot of doing something big, in the middle, we find ways to move forward with things that greater synergies can be identified and executed upon with shifts. And we already know for a fact that if you operate today in a licensing and permitting part of the world, you have to have multiple touch points back and forth between bodies, and there can be pain points there. We know that while we have fire and police, EMS is on the other side, and there are synergies we lose from that. We know that we've heard many anecdotal discussions around Parks and Rec and how that can better be achieved through. So there's countless examples of where we know friction exists because of separate bifurcated governance models. The question is, can we actually do some analysis to say with the folks involved, so it's not one side telling another, here's the deal, can we come upon this? I think it will be highly productive, even if we fall short of an ultimate objective, because we'll start collaborating as multiple municipal bodies at an elected level, which unfortunately in the past just doesn't happen that often.
Yeah, I think Mr. Bukhari spoke well about the discussions that we've had. Of course, the legislative agendas are hard pieces of policy that we pass every year. And this committee has worked hard over the past couple of years to kind of bring that process into a more collaborative and effective process across our different kind of policy areas. But this issue of consolidation, or at least consolidated approaches or consolidated methods, continues to come up in just about all those policy area discussions. There has been a willingness of other colleagues, of our colleagues, to broach the issue in different council discussions. Many of us are a part of sort of ad hoc on our own efforts to bring more collaboration around consolidated approaches. I'm working with a group of county commissioners, city council members, as well as school board members, and working with our staffs of figuring out how to do this as it relates to creating a policy roundtable and or different approaches to community violence. I know me and Mr. Driggs have been part of some conversations around parks and so on and so forth. So there does seem to be the appetite to broach this subject. And as the mayor is suggesting that we take a different approach to how our committees work on a policy level basis, Mr. Bukhari and I pretty much landed on, hey, this is the high level policy area that we would like to see and bring to the table. So,
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, absolutely. Mr. Driggs?
I just wanted to emphasize, especially given the history of this topic, any conversations we have, we need to be very mindful of reaching out to the towns, letting them know what we're thinking, making clear that they will have a role in a conversation that might affect them, because, that's a major sticking point. Mr. Bukhari did not suggest a full consolidation, so I think that's good. But just want to emphasize that for the towns, this subject is something that makes them nervous, because what happens if you consolidate is that this new consolidated government consists 80% of Charlotte, and they feel that their own autonomy could be compromised. So I just hope we'll keep that in mind, make a point of communicating with the towns as we explore this. Thank you.
I think that's a point well taken. And again, I think the way Mr. Bukhari described it, I think it doesn't just allow for it, it necessitates that type of thinking. So absolutely. Mr. Newton?
I agree. I have nothing to add. Thank you, Mr. Winston. Thanks, everyone.
I think that was unanimous, Mr. Fenn.
Mr. Winston, I guess what I'll do now is we'll put together the summary of the meeting. We'll put it into the form that's required for the strategy session. And did you want to take a vote just to formalize it, solemnize it, just so we can say it's a 4-0 vote?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to present the proposed key policy questions number 1 and 2 to full council for consideration in the next action briefing.
Second.
Or strategy session, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. We'll do a roll call. Mr. Bakari?
Yes.
Mr. Driggs?
Yes.
Mr. Newton?
Yes.
And I'm a yes.
And that was 4-0. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay. Mr. Winston, that is the end of our agenda. Nothing else to discuss. Our next meeting is on Monday, February 21st, and we'll have it at 2 p.m. or we're planning for it at 2 p.m. that day. And I know that we have 2 new members, Mr. Driggs and Ms. Eisel, and I'd be glad to talk with both of them just to make sure that the time that we meet is works for them.
I will make one more comment. I'm sorry, it's germane to that last topic area. Like I said, I have been meeting with a group of council members, county commissioners, and school board members on a consolidated policy approach to dealing with youth violence and violence in general in the community. We have gotten to the point where we really can. We're running to the edge of what we can do on an ad hoc basis, and we are working with our respective staffs. And I brought co-chair Bakari into the mix a bit to see if there is an opportunity to have a joint meeting of our intergovernmental committees in the near future. And we can follow up offline about this. I don't think it's necessarily right for right now. I just wanted to give the committee a little bit of vision about what's happening offline. Then I'm saying a motion to close.
So moved.
So second.
Aye.
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 Aye.